On Christmas night, 1776, George Washington stood on the banks of the Delaware River watching his army disintegrate. The Continental Army had been chased out of New York. It had been chased across New Jersey. It had lost battle after battle against the most professional military force on Earth. Desertions were epidemic. Enlistments were expiring. In just 6 days, most of Washington's remaining soldiers would simply go home, their terms of service complete. The cause of American independence was dying. Not in some distant future, not as a theoretical possibility, but right now, in the freezing December darkness, as ice floes drifted down the river and exhausted men huddled in camps without adequate food, clothing, or hope. Washington had perhaps 3,000 soldiers left. The British had over 30,000 professional troops, plus thousands of German mercenaries, plus the most powerful navy in the world, plus virtually unlimited resources from the greatest empire on Earth. By any rational calculation, the revolution was over. And that's when Washington decided to do something completely insane. He would attack, on Christmas night, across an ice-choked river, against a garrison of Hessian professionals who had been defeating American forces all year. He would bet everything, the army, the revolution, his own life on one desperate throw of the dice. What happened that night would become legend. But it was only one moment in an 8-year struggle that defied every expectation, broke every rule, and somehow against all odds, against all logic, against the entire weight of history, ended with a collection of farmers, merchants, and frontier riflemen defeating the mightiest military power the world had ever seen. This is the story of the American Revolutionary War, not the sanitized version from elementary school textbooks, but the real story, the chaos, the suffering, the moments of despair, and the improbable chain of events that created a nation. It's a story about how the impossible becomes possible. And it begins with a simple question: how do you fight an empire? The American colonies in 1775 were not natural rebels. For over a century and a half, they had been loyal subjects of the British Crown. They had fought in Britain's wars, traded under Britain's protection, and generally prospered within the British imperial system. Most colonists considered themselves Englishmen, perhaps Englishmen who happened to live across an ocean, but Englishmen nonetheless. They celebrated the King's birthday. They drank toasts to British victories. They named their towns after English places and their children after English monarchs. The idea of independence from Britain would have struck most colonists in 1760 as absurd, even treasonous. So what changed? The short answer is, the 7 Years' War changed everything. That global conflict, which ended in 1763, had been spectacularly successful for Britain. France was expelled from North America. British power was established from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. The colonists had fought alongside British regulars and shared in the triumph. But victory came with a price tag. Britain had accumulated enormous debts, and someone had to pay them. The British government looked at the American colonies, which had been defended at such great cost, and decided the colonists should contribute. What followed was a series of taxes and regulations that, while relatively modest by European standards, struck the colonists as fundamentally unjust. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, duties on tea and paper and glass. Each measure provoked resistance. Each resistance provoked a heavier British response. Each escalation pushed the colonies further toward confrontation. But here's the crucial thing: the colonists weren't angry about the money. The amounts involved were trivial compared to taxes paid by English subjects at home. What enraged the colonists was the principle: no taxation without representation. The colonists had no members in Parliament. They had no voice in the decisions that affected their lives. And if Parliament could tax them without their consent, what else could Parliament do? The power to tax was the power to destroy. If that power could be exercised arbitrarily, then the colonists had no rights at all. This wasn't just about tea or stamps. It was about whether Englishmen living in America had the same rights as Englishmen living in England. It was about consent of the governed. It was about whether the colonies were partners in the empire or merely possessions of it. The British government, for its part, simply couldn't understand what the fuss was about. Parliament was sovereign. Parliament could legislate for all British territories. The colonists were British subjects, therefore Parliament could tax them. The logic seemed unassailable. Two completely different ideas of governance were colliding. Two completely different understandings of rights and representation. And neither side could back down without abandoning fundamental principles. War became inevitable not because of any single act, but because two incompatible visions of political legitimacy could not coexist. The first shots were fired on April 19, 1775, in the Massachusetts towns of Lexington and Concord. British forces had marched from Boston to seize colonial military supplies rumored to be stored in Concord. Someone history still debates who fired a shot on Lexington Green. Within seconds, 8 American militiamen lay dead. The British continued to Concord, where they found some of the supplies they sought. But by then, militia companies from surrounding towns were converging. As the British began their march back to Boston, they found themselves under constant fire from colonists shooting from behind walls, trees, and buildings. It was not the kind of warfare the British expected. There were no orderly lines, no formal volleys, no surrender when the position became untenable. Just an endless gauntlet of sniping that turned the road back to Boston into a nightmare. By the time the British reached safety, they had suffered nearly 300 casualties. American losses were less than 100. The mythology of the American citizen soldier, the farmer, who could pick up his rifle and defeat professional armies was born that day. It was also, in many ways, misleading. The success at Lexington and Concord came from specific circumstances. A long, exposed road, excellent terrain for harassment, a British force that wasn't prepared for this kind of fighting. It was guerrilla warfare at its most effective, conducted by men who knew the ground intimately. But guerrilla tactics couldn't win a war by themselves. They couldn't capture cities. They couldn't defend territory. They couldn't force a decisive outcome. At some point, the colonies would need a real army, an army that could stand in open battle against British regulars. Building that army would be the great challenge of the next 8 years. 2 months after Lexington and Concord, the two sides met in a very different kind of battle. The British garrison in Boston was surrounded by thousands of colonial militia who had gathered in the wake of the April fighting. American forces occupied positions on the hills overlooking the city, threatening British lines and demonstrating that the Empire's authority in Massachusetts had effectively collapsed. On June 17, 1775, the British decided to clear the Americans from Breed's Hill and the surrounding high ground. What followed became known through a geographical error as the Battle of Bunker Hill. The British assault was a textbook demonstration of 18th century European warfare. Lines of redcoats advanced up the hill in precise formation, bayonets fixed, drums beating. They expected the undisciplined colonial rabble to break and flee at the first sign of professional troops. The colonists waited. The famous order, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," reflected the practical reality that American ammunition was limited. Every shot had to count. When the Americans finally fired, the effect was devastating. The front ranks of the British assault simply dissolved. The survivors fell back, reformed, and attacked again. Again, they were repulsed. Bodies accumulated on the hillside. The third assault finally succeeded, but only because the Americans had run out of ammunition. The colonists retreated in relatively good order, having inflicted over 1,000 British casualties. American losses were around 400. Bunker Hill was technically a British victory. They held the ground at the end of the day. But it was the kind of victory that felt like defeat. A British officer reportedly said a few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America. The battle proved two things. First, American forces could stand against regulars, could inflict terrible casualties, could fight with discipline and courage. Second, they couldn't hold ground without supplies, without coordination, without the logistical backbone that only a real army could provide. America needed that army, and it needed someone to lead it. George Washington arrived at Cambridge, Massachusetts, in July 1775 to take command of the newly designated Continental Army. What he found appalled him. The army was really a collection of militia companies from various colonies, each with its own officers, its own traditions, its own ideas about discipline and hierarchy. Men elected their own officers, which meant officers who enforced discipline might find themselves voted out of their positions. Soldiers came and went as they pleased. Sanitation was non-existent. Military supplies were scarce and haphazardly distributed. Washington, a Virginia gentleman with a deep belief in order and hierarchy, was horrified by the egalitarian chaos of the New England forces. These men didn't act like soldiers. They didn't defer to their officers. They seemed to think they were doing everyone a favor by showing up at all. The task Washington faced was not simply military, it was transformational. He had to take this collection of individualistic, democratic, slightly anarchic colonial volunteers and turn them into something that could face the British Army in open battle. It would take years, and the process would nearly destroy the Revolution several times over. The first major test came in New York in the summer of 1776. By this point, momentous things had happened. The Declaration of Independence had been signed. The colonies had formally broken with Britain. There was no going back. The British responded with the largest expeditionary force in their history to that point. Over 30,000 soldiers, regulars, and Hessian mercenaries backed by a fleet of hundreds of ships descended on New York Harbor. The intention was clear: crush the rebellion quickly and decisively before it could spread. Washington's army, defending New York, numbered perhaps 20,000 men, but numbers only tell part of the story. The British troops were professionals, well-equipped, well-trained, experienced in the formal tactics of European warfare. The Americans were still learning. Many had never been in a major battle. Their equipment was inferior, their training incomplete, their command structure still developing. The result was catastrophic. At the Battle of Long Island on August 27, 1776, British forces outflanked the American positions and inflicted a crushing defeat. Nearly 1,000 Americans were captured, with hundreds more killed or wounded. Only a combination of fog, a brilliant nighttime evacuation, and British caution prevented the entire American force from being destroyed. Washington retreated to Manhattan. The British followed. Battle after battle went against the Americans. Kip's Bay, Harlem Heights, White Plains, each engagement demonstrated the same brutal reality. In open battle, in formal combat, the Americans couldn't match British professionals. The low point came in November, when British forces captured Fort Washington on Manhattan, taking nearly 3,000 American prisoners, the worst single loss the Continental Army would suffer in the entire war. The prisoners would largely die in the horrific conditions of British prison ships, adding tragedy to disaster. By December, Washington had been driven entirely out of New York, chased across New Jersey, and pushed to the far side of the Delaware River. The army that had begun the year with such optimism was reduced to a frozen, starving remnant. This was the moment when Washington stood on the riverbank, watching his revolution die. The crossing of the Delaware on Christmas night, 1776, was an act of pure desperation. Washington's plan was to cross the river at 3 points, converging on the Hessian garrison at Trenton from multiple directions. The weather was terrible: sleet, snow, ice flows in the river that made the crossing extraordinarily dangerous. One of the 3 crossing forces never made it across. Another made it, but arrived too late to participate. Only Washington's main force completed the crossing and the march to Trenton. They arrived at dawn, exhausted, frozen, many without adequate shoes or coats. They were going up against Hessian troops who were rested, warm, and professional. But the Hessians weren't expecting an attack, not in this weather, not on Christmas. They had celebrated the holiday, and while they weren't drunk as later mythology would claim, they were not on high alert. When the American assault began, confusion reigned. The battle lasted about 90 minutes. American artillery swept the streets. Hessian attempts to form lines were disrupted before they could coalesce. The Hessian commander, Johann Rohl, was mortally wounded trying to rally his men. By the time it was over, around 20 Hessians were dead and nearly 1,000 had surrendered. American casualties were minimal. Some accounts say no Americans were killed in the battle itself, though several froze to death during the march. It was, by the standards of the major battles to come, a small engagement. But its psychological impact was immense. Trenton proved that the Continental Army could win. It proved that Washington could outthink his enemies, that American soldiers could perform under impossible conditions, that the cause was not yet lost. Enlistments that had been about to expire were extended. Volunteers began to return. The Revolution, which had been gasping for breath, suddenly had oxygen again. A week later, Washington won again at Princeton, outmaneuvering a British force and proving that Trenton had not been a fluke. The New York campaign had been a disaster, but its desperate conclusion had saved the Revolution. The year 1777 would bring the conflict to a turning point, though not in the way anyone expected. The British strategy for 1777 was ambitious. 3 forces would converge on Albany, New York, cutting New England off from the rest of the colonies. General John Burgoyne would march south from Canada. A smaller force would move east from Lake Ontario, and General William Howe would march north from New York City. The plan looked excellent on paper. In practice, it fell apart almost immediately. Howe decided, for reasons historians still debate, to attack Philadelphia instead of marching to Albany. The coordination that the strategy required never materialized. And Burgoyne, marching south through the wilderness of upstate New York, found himself increasingly isolated. The campaign that followed was a masterclass in how not to conduct military operations in hostile territory. Burgoyne's army moved slowly, burdened by enormous amounts of baggage, including the personal effects of officers who expected to campaign in style. The terrain was brutal forests, swamps, and hills that made every mile a struggle. American forces felled trees across the roads, destroyed bridges, and harassed the British column constantly. Supply lines stretched and broke. Native American allies, initially numerous, began to drift away as the campaign bogged down. A detachment sent to seize supplies in Vermont was ambushed and destroyed at the Battle of Bennington, costing Burgoyne nearly 1,000 men. By September, Burgoyne's force was in serious trouble, but retreat seemed as impossible as advance. He pressed on toward Albany, hoping that Howe would arrive to support him. Howe never came. He was busy capturing Philadelphia, a strategic dead end that accomplished nothing except giving the British another city to garrison. What met Burgoyne instead was an American army under General Horatio Gates, reinforced by militia flooding in from the surrounding region. At Saratoga, Burgoyne found himself facing a force that now outnumbered his own depleted army by nearly 3-1. The battles of Saratoga, fought on September 19th and October 7th, 1777, were among the bloodiest of the entire war. Burgoyne attacked the American positions repeatedly, trying to break through to Albany. Each assault was repulsed with heavy losses. The Americans, fighting from prepared positions with clear fields of fire, slaughtered the British and German attackers in waves. The most dramatic figure of the battle was not the American commander, Horatio Gates, who directed operations from behind the lines. It was Benedict Arnold, not yet a traitor, but at this moment the most aggressive and capable field commander in the Continental Army. Arnold led charge after charge against the British lines, seemingly oblivious to danger, rallying troops through sheer force of personality. During the second battle, he was everywhere at once, leading infantry assaults, directing artillery, personally storming enemy redoubts. A musket ball shattered his leg during the final assault, ending his fighting career but cementing his reputation as an American hero. The irony of Arnold's later betrayal is made sharper by his genuine heroism at Saratoga. The man who would become synonymous with treason was, on that October day, the embodiment of American courage. By October 17th, Burgoyne's situation was hopeless. His army had suffered over 1,000 casualties in the two battles. He was surrounded, outnumbered, and out of supplies. On that date, he surrendered his entire force, nearly 6,000 soldiers, to the Americans. It was the most significant American victory of the war so far. An entire British army had been captured. The strategic plan to cut the colonies in half had failed completely. And for the first time, it appeared that the Americans might actually be able to win this war. But the most important consequence of Saratoga didn't happen on the battlefield. It happened in the courts of Europe. France had been watching the American Revolution with great interest since its beginning. The French government had many reasons to hope for American success. Revenge for the humiliations of the 7 Years' War was certainly among them. Britain's loss would be France's gain, a weakened rival, a disrupted empire, a new ally in the Western Hemisphere. But France was not willing to openly support a losing cause. Entering a war against Britain was an enormous risk. If the Americans collapsed quickly, France would be left fighting alone against the full weight of British power. The French needed proof that the Americans could actually win before they would commit. Saratoga provided that proof. News of Burgoyne's surrender reached Paris in December 1777. Within weeks, French officials were negotiating treaties of alliance and commerce with American representatives, led by the shrewd and charming Benjamin Franklin. On February 6, 1778, France formally recognized American independence and entered into a military alliance. This changed everything. France brought things the Americans desperately needed: money, supplies, professional military expertise, and most critically a navy that could challenge British control of the seas. For the first time, Britain would have to fight a global war, defending territories from the Caribbean to India while simultaneously trying to crush the American rebellion. Spain would join the war in 1779, adding another naval power to the anti-British coalition. The Dutch would follow in 1780. What had begun as a colonial rebellion was now a world war, with Britain facing enemies on every front. The British, who had expected a quick suppression of untrained colonials, suddenly found themselves fighting for imperial survival. While diplomats negotiated in Paris, the Continental Army was enduring its darkest hour at a place called Valley Forge. The winter of 1777 to 1778 was not unusually cold. Later mythology would exaggerate the weather conditions. But the suffering was real. Washington's army, encamped in Pennsylvania after losing Philadelphia to Howe, faced conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. The problems were not primarily meteorological. They were logistical and organizational. The supply system had collapsed. Food was scarce. Soldiers sometimes went days without meat. Clothing was inadequate. Thousands of men lacked shoes, coats, or blankets. Shelter was primitive. Huts were constructed gradually, and many soldiers lived in tents through the worst of the weather. Disease swept through the camp. Typhus, typhoid, dysentery, and smallpox killed far more men than British bullets ever would. At Valley Forge alone, perhaps 2,000 soldiers died, roughly 1 in 6 of those who entered the camp. Desertions were epidemic. Men simply walked away, unable to endure the conditions any longer. Officers resigned their commissions. The army that had seemed so promising after Saratoga was melting away through attrition. And yet, something remarkable happened at Valley Forge. The army that emerged in the spring of 1778 was fundamentally different from the one that had entered the previous winter. The transformation came largely through the efforts of one man, Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. Steuben was a Prussian officer who had served under Frederick the Great, or so he claimed. In reality, his rank and experience were considerably less distinguished than his credentials suggested. He had been a captain, not a general, and had left Prussian service under somewhat unclear circumstances. But Steuben was a genuine military professional, and he understood something that most American officers did not: how to turn raw recruits into disciplined soldiers. He began with the basics: drill, marching in formation, the manual of arms, loading and firing in coordinated volleys. Bayonet training, something the Americans had consistently neglected, putting them at a severe disadvantage in close combat. Steuben couldn't speak English. He would demonstrate maneuvers himself, then have translators explain what he wanted. When soldiers made mistakes, he would curse at them in a combination of German and French that was somehow simultaneously terrifying and endearing. The troops loved him. More importantly, they learned. By spring, the Continental Army could perform the synchronized movements that were essential to 18th century warfare. They could form lines, execute volleys, and crucially charge with the bayonet. They were becoming professionals. When the British evacuated Philadelphia in June 1778 and marched across New Jersey toward New York, Washington's army followed. At the Battle of Monmouth on June 28th, the two forces clashed in brutal heat. Monmouth was not a decisive American victory. It was fought to a draw, with both sides suffering significant casualties, but that draw was itself a triumph. For the first time, the Continental Army had stood toe-to-toe with British regulars in a major open-field battle and held its ground. The British did not win. The Americans did not break. Valley Forge had worked. The army was real now. The war after 1778 entered a new phase, shaped by French entry and British strategic adjustments. The British could no longer concentrate all their forces on crushing the rebellion. They had to defend Caribbean sugar islands, which were enormously valuable. They had to protect maritime commerce, which was essential to the British economy. They had to worry about potential French invasions of Britain itself. This meant that forces in America would receive fewer reinforcements. The era of massive British expeditionary armies was over. The British response was to shift the focus of the war southward. The thinking was that the southern colonies, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, were more loyalist than the rebellious North. If British forces could establish control there, they could rally local Tories, create self-sustaining bases of royal authority, and gradually roll back the rebellion from south to north. It was a reasonable strategy, and for a time, it seemed to be working. Savannah, Georgia fell to British forces in December 1778. Charleston, South Carolina, one of the largest cities in America, fell in May 1780, along with nearly 5,000 American prisoners. It was the worst American defeat of the war, dwarfing even the losses in New York. British forces under Lord Cornwallis pushed into the Carolina interior, winning battle after battle against American forces that seemed unable to stop them. At Camden in August 1780, Cornwallis destroyed an American army under Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, whose reputation never recovered. The American cause in the South seemed to be collapsing. What saved the Southern campaign was a different kind of warfare, one that the conventional armies couldn't quite suppress. The Southern backcountry was perfect terrain for guerrilla operations. Dense forests, swampy lowlands, scattered settlements, and populations deeply divided between patriot and loyalist created conditions where small, mobile forces could operate indefinitely. Leaders like Francis Marion the Swamp Fox, Thomas Sumter and Andrew Pickens led bands of partisan fighters who struck British outposts, ambushed supply convoys, and vanished into the wilderness before the enemy could respond. They couldn't hold territory or win conventional battles, but they could make British control of the countryside impossible. The partisan war was brutal. Atrocities were committed by both sides. Loyalists and patriots burned each other's homes, killed each other's families, conducted cycles of revenge that would poison relations in the region for generations. It was civil war in the truest and ugliest sense, but the partisans accomplished something essential. They prevented the British from consolidating control. Every time Cornwallis advanced, leaving garrisons behind to secure his conquests, those garrisons came under attack. Supply lines were harassed. Communication was disrupted. The territory that looked conquered on a map remained contested in reality. The Southern strategy required pacification. The partisans made pacification impossible. The turning point in the South came in October 1780 at a place called Kings Mountain. A force of roughly 1,000 Loyalist militia, commanded by British Major Patrick Ferguson, had been conducting operations in the Carolina backcountry. Ferguson had boasted that the rebels couldn't touch him on Kings Mountain and had threatened to march over the mountains and lay waste to Patriot settlements beyond. The threat galvanized the backcountry. Militia units from across the region, frontiersmen from what would become Tennessee, riflemen from Virginia, and the Carolinas converged on Ferguson's position. They were not Continental Army soldiers. They were local men fighting for their homes and families, armed with the long rifles that had become symbols of frontier America. On October 7th, they surrounded Kings Mountain and attacked from all sides. Ferguson's Loyalists fought desperately, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. The terrain that Ferguson had thought would protect him became a trap, with Patriot riflemen firing from the trees below into the exposed hilltop. Ferguson himself was killed, shot from his horse while trying to rally his men. The battle lasted about an hour. When it was over, the Loyalist force had been annihilated, nearly 300 killed, hundreds more captured. Patriot losses were about 90. Kings Mountain shattered Loyalist morale in the South. The promised Tory uprising that British strategy depended on never materialized. Men who might have supported the Crown looked at what happened to Ferguson's force and decided to stay home. 3 months later, at the Battle of Cowpens, American forces under Daniel Morgan achieved an even more impressive tactical victory, destroying a British force through a brilliant combination of conventional and irregular tactics. Cornwallis lost over 800 men killed or captured a significant portion of his fighting strength. The South was slipping away. Cornwallis responded to his deteriorating situation by gambling everything on an aggressive offensive. Rather than continue the frustrating work of pacifying the Carolinas, he decided to march north into Virginia. His theory was that the rebellion's strength in the South came from support and supplies flowing from Virginia. Cut off the head, and the body would die. The American commander opposing him was Nathaniel Greene, perhaps the most underrated general of the entire war. Greene was a former Quaker from Rhode Island, self-taught in military affairs, who had risen through the ranks by demonstrating an exceptional understanding of strategy and logistics. Greene understood something crucial. He didn't have to defeat Cornwallis. He just had to keep his army intact while wearing the British down. "We fight, get beat, rise and fight again," he wrote to a friend. It was a strategy of survival, of attrition, of trading space for time. The campaign that followed was a chase across hundreds of miles of North Carolina. Greene retreated, turned, fought, retreated again. At Guilford Courthouse in March 1781, he offered battle on ground of his choosing. Cornwallis won the field, but at a cost of over 500 casualties, nearly a quarter of his force. Another such victory, wrote the British politician Charles James Fox, would ruin the British army. Cornwallis was winning battles and losing the war. His army was shrinking with every engagement. His supply lines were impossible to secure. The Carolina loyalists he had hoped to rally remained passive or actively hostile. Cornwallis made his decision. He would march to Virginia. Virginia in the spring of 1781 was a sideshow that was about to become the main event. British forces had been conducting raids up and down the Virginia coast for months. Benedict Arnold now fighting for the British after his treason in 1780 had burned Richmond and terrorized the countryside. American forces in the state were weak and poorly coordinated. Cornwallis arrived with his battered army in May, linking up with other British forces to create a substantial force of perhaps 7,000 soldiers. He spent the summer maneuvering through Virginia, looking for an opportunity to bring American forces to decisive battle. By August, he had established a base at Yorktown, a small tobacco port on the Chesapeake Bay. It was a good position, easily supplied by sea, positioned to support future operations into the Virginia interior. And this is where everything converged. Washington had been planning an attack on New York City, which remained the primary British base in America. But when news arrived that a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was sailing for the Chesapeake rather than New York, Washington saw an opportunity. If the French fleet could control the bay, Cornwallis would be trapped. No supplies could reach him, no reinforcements could arrive. No escape by sea would be possible. Washington pivoted with remarkable speed. He left a token force to threaten New York, keeping the British there guessing about his intentions, and marched the rest of his army along with French forces under the Comte de Rochambeau south toward Virginia. It was a calculated risk. If the French fleet failed to arrive, if British ships drove them off, if Cornwallis escaped before the trap could close, the campaign would be a catastrophic failure. Washington was betting everything on coordination across thousands of miles, with 18th century communications and the vagaries of weather and wind. The Battle of the Chesapeake on September 5, 1781, was perhaps the most strategically decisive naval engagement in American history. The French fleet under de Grasse met a British fleet under Admiral Thomas Graves in the waters off the Virginia Capes. The battle itself was tactically inconclusive. Both sides suffered damage. Neither was destroyed. But Graves withdrew to New York for repairs, leaving de Grasse in control of the bay. That was all that mattered. Cornwallis was now trapped. Washington's army, Americans and French combined, nearly 17,000 strong, surrounded him by land. The French fleet blocked any escape by sea. The most powerful military force in America was caught in a net from which there was no escape. The siege of Yorktown began on September 28, 1781. Siege warfare in the 18th century followed established patterns. Trenches were dug, advancing toward the enemy works in parallel lines. Artillery was brought forward to batter the defenses. Assault troops prepared to storm the weakened fortifications. The Allies followed the textbook with professional precision. French engineers, experts in siege operations, directed the construction of trenches that crept steadily closer to the British lines. American and French artillery pounded Yorktown day and night. Cornwallis's situation was hopeless, and he knew it. He appealed to Clinton in New York for relief, but the British fleet that finally sailed was too late and too weak to break through the French naval barrier. Disease swept through the crowded British positions. Ammunition ran low. Food became scarce. On October 14th, Allied forces stormed to key British redoubts in nighttime assaults. Alexander Hamilton led the American attack on one position, achieving the glory he had been seeking throughout the war. French forces took the other. The Allied guns were now close enough to make the British position untenable. Cornwallis tried a desperate gambit, evacuating his army across the river under cover of darkness, but a storm scattered his boats and forced him to abandon the attempt. On October 17, 1781, exactly 4 years after Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga, British drummer appeared on the parapet at Yorktown, followed by an officer waving a white handkerchief. Cornwallis wanted to negotiate. The surrender ceremony at Yorktown on October 19, 1781, was heavy with symbolism. Cornwallis himself did not attend. He claimed illness, though most historians believe it was simply too humiliating for a British nobleman to personally surrender to a colonial upstart. He sent his second-in-command, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, in his place. O'Hara first tried to surrender to the French commander, Rochambeau, perhaps hoping the shame would be lessened by yielding to a fellow European aristocrat rather than an American. Rochambeau refused, directing O'Hara to Washington. Washington, maintaining his own dignity, delegated the acceptance of the sword to his second-in-command, Benjamin Lincoln. It was a carefully choreographed dance of honor and humiliation. The British troops marched out between two lines, French forces on one side, Americans on the other. According to tradition, the British bands played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." Whether this actually happened is debated by historians, but the sentiment was accurate enough. The world had indeed turned upside down. Over 7,000 British soldiers laid down their arms. Cornwallis's army, one of the largest British forces in America, ceased to exist. The surrender was complete. When the news reached London, Lord North, the Prime Minister who had prosecuted the war for years, reportedly took it as he would have taken a ball in the breast. He paced his room, exclaiming, "Oh God! It is all over! It is all over! He was right!" Yorktown didn't end the Revolutionary War immediately. Fighting would continue for another 2 years in various theaters. But it ended any realistic hope of Britain reconquering the colonies. The political will to continue the war simply evaporated. The aftermath of Yorktown saw the British war effort collapse not on the battlefield, but in Parliament. The cost of the war had become staggering. Britain was fighting not just in America, but against France in the Caribbean, against Spain in the Mediterranean, against the Dutch in the East Indies. The national debt was soaring. The promised quick victory over colonial farmers had turned into an endless, expensive quagmire. And for what? Even if Britain somehow managed to reconquer the colonies, could they ever be governed again? The Americans had proven they would fight. They had proven they could win. Suppressing them permanently would require a military occupation that Britain simply couldn't afford. In February 1782, the House of Commons voted against continuing offensive operations in America. Lord North's government fell. The new ministry, led by the Marquis of Rockingham and then the Earl of Shelburne, was committed to ending the war. Peace negotiations began in Paris. The American delegation, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, proved to be shrewd negotiators, playing the British against the French to secure the best possible terms. The French alliance had been essential to American victory, but French and American interests were not identical. France wanted a weak America, dependent on French support, unable to become a rival. The American negotiators recognized this and ultimately chose to negotiate directly with Britain, securing terms more favorable than the French would have preferred. The Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783. Its terms were remarkably generous to the new nation. Britain recognized American independence, the fundamental goal of the entire war. The boundaries of the United States were established. The Atlantic Ocean to the east, the Mississippi River to the west, Canada to the north, Florida to the south. Fishing rights off Newfoundland were guaranteed. Debts and property claims were to be resolved through various mechanisms. The United States of America was now officially a sovereign nation. But what kind of nation? The victory over Britain had created an independent country, but it had not created a stable or unified one. The Articles of Confederation, which had governed the country during the war, were proving woefully inadequate for peacetime. The national government had no power to tax. It couldn't regulate commerce between states. It couldn't enforce its own laws. It depended on the states for everything and could compel nothing. Each state printed its own currency. Each state had its own trade policies. Each state jealously guarded its sovereignty against any central authority. The army that had won independence was falling apart. Soldiers who had been promised pay and pensions found that Congress had no money to fulfill those promises. In 1783, officers at Newburgh, New York, came dangerously close to mutiny, potentially marching on Congress to demand their due. Only Washington's personal intervention, a dramatic speech in which he fumbled for his glasses and remarked that he had grown gray in your service and now find myself growing blind, defused the crisis. Washington's willingness to give up power rather than seize it was perhaps the most remarkable act of the entire Revolutionary period. He had the army's loyalty. He could have made himself a dictator, a king, anything he wanted. Instead, he resigned his commission and went home to Mount Vernon. King George III, upon hearing that Washington intended to return to private life, reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." Washington did it, and the precedent he set: civilian control of the military, the peaceful transfer of power, the rejection of personal rule would shape American government for centuries. The problems of the Confederation would eventually lead to the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and the creation of the stronger federal government that still exists today. But that's a story for another time. What matters for our purposes is understanding what the Revolutionary War actually accomplished and how. The question we started with was, how did farmers beat the world's strongest army? And the answer is more complicated than the mythology suggests. The Americans didn't simply outfight the British. In most conventional battles, the British won. Their professional soldiers, their superior training, their experienced officers, these advantages were real and decisive in most open field engagements. What the Americans did was survive long enough for other factors to tip the balance. Geography was the first great American advantage. The 13 colonies stretched over 1,000 miles along the Atlantic coast, with a vast, largely wilderness interior. Conquering this territory was a logistical nightmare. Every army the British sent had to be supplied across 3,000 miles of ocean. Every soldier, every musket ball, every biscuit had to come from Britain or be purchased locally at enormous expense. The Americans, by contrast, were fighting on home ground. They knew the terrain. They could disperse into the countryside when defeated and reassemble when the British moved on. They didn't have to win, they just had to not lose. This geographical reality meant that Britain faced an almost impossible task. To actually defeat the rebellion, they would have had to occupy the entire country, suppress resistance everywhere simultaneously, and maintain that occupation indefinitely. They didn't have the manpower, they didn't have the money, they didn't have the political will. The second American advantage was time. Every year the war continued, it became harder for Britain to sustain. The costs mounted, the domestic opposition grew. The international situation deteriorated. Washington understood this intuitively. His strategy was not to win decisive battles. He knew he couldn't reliably do that. His strategy was to keep the Continental Army alive, to maintain a credible force in the field, to preserve the symbol and reality of American resistance, no matter how many setbacks occurred. "We should on all occasions avoid a general action," Washington wrote, "or put anything to the risque, unless compelled by a necessity, into which we ought never to be drawn." This was not the strategy of a military genius seeking glory. It was the strategy of a survivor, a man who understood that the war would be won by the side that didn't give up. Time and again, Washington retreated when a more aggressive commander might have stood and fought. Time and again, he preserved his army to fight another day. The defeats were painful: New York, Brandywine, Germantown, but the army survived. And as long as it survived, the revolution survived. The third American advantage was international support, particularly from France. French money, French supplies, French military expertise, and French naval power transformed the war. Without France, it is difficult to imagine how the Americans could have won. The loans and subsidies that flowed from Paris kept the Continental Army fed, clothed, and armed during the darkest periods. French officers like Lafayette and Steuben provided professional military knowledge that the Americans desperately lacked. And the French Navy that was the decisive factor. Britain's greatest advantage had always been sea power. The Royal Navy could transport troops anywhere along the American coast, could supply isolated garrisons, could evacuate forces that got into trouble. British control of the seas meant that no American victory was ever truly decisive. The British could always regroup, reinforce, and return. French entry changed that calculation. Suddenly, the British had to defend their naval supremacy against a rival fleet. Suddenly, they couldn't assume control of American waters. And at Yorktown, when French ships blocked the Chesapeake Bay, that naval superiority proved decisive. Cornwallis surrendered not because he was outfought on land, but because he was cut off by sea. The French fleet made the victory possible. The fourth American advantage was British mistakes. The British made errors throughout the war: strategic, tactical, and political. They underestimated American resolve. They overestimated Loyalist support. They failed to coordinate their forces effectively. They pursued strategies that looked good on paper but proved impossible to execute. The decision to split forces in 1777, leading to Burgoyne's disaster at Saratoga, was perhaps the single greatest British blunder. Had Howe marched to Albany as originally planned, had Burgoyne received the support he expected, the outcome might have been very different. Instead, an entire army was lost, and France was convinced to enter the war. But the most fundamental British mistake was political rather than military. They never understood what they were fighting. The British saw the rebellion as a conspiracy of troublemakers, a small faction of radicals who had somehow led the masses astray. They believed that most colonists were loyal to the crown and would rally to British authority once the rebellion was suppressed. They believed that a show of force would bring the Americans to their senses. They were wrong. The revolution had deep roots. It represented genuine grievances, genuine ideological commitments, a genuine vision of self-government that could not be crushed by military force alone. Every British atrocity, every harsh occupation measure, every punishment of rebels, these didn't suppress resistance. They inflamed it. The British won battles and lost the war because they never grasped that they were fighting not just an army, but an idea. What was that idea? At its core, the American Revolution was about self-government. The right of a people to determine their own laws, choose their own leaders, and shape their own destiny. The belief that legitimate government derives its power from the consent of the governed, not from the hereditary claims of kings or the military might of empires. These ideas were not new. They drew on English traditions of liberty stretching back to Magna Carta. They drew on Enlightenment philosophy, on the writings of John Locke and Montesquieu and others. They drew on the practical experience of colonial self-government that had developed over a century and a half. But the American Revolution transformed these ideas from theory into practice. For the first time in modern history, a people had successfully rebelled against their sovereign and established a republic based on principles of popular sovereignty and natural rights. The Declaration of Independence declared that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words would echo through history. They would inspire the French Revolution, the Latin American independence movements, the abolition of slavery, the civil rights movement, and countless other struggles for freedom around the world. They were also, of course, incomplete. The men who wrote them owned slaves. The Republic they created extended citizenship only to white men. The gap between revolutionary ideals and American reality would persist for centuries and persists still today. But the ideals themselves were revolutionary. They created a standard by which America could be judged and found wanting. They provided the language that future generations would use to demand that the country live up to its founding promises. The revolution was not just about independence from Britain. It was about creating a new kind of nation, based on new principles, committed to new ideals. That project remains unfinished. What did it cost to achieve this revolution? The human toll was substantial, though modest by the standards of later wars. Somewhere between 25,000 and 70,000 Americans died. The range is wide because records were poor and many deaths from disease went uncounted. British and Hessian losses were comparable. Perhaps 50,000 American loyalists fled the country, many to Canada. Their property was confiscated, their ties to home severed permanently. They were the losers of the Revolution, and their story is often forgotten. Native Americans, who had largely sided with the British in hopes of restraining colonial expansion, suffered catastrophically. The victory of the colonists meant the opening of western lands to settlement, the destruction of treaties that had offered some protection, and the acceleration of dispossession that would continue for another century. Enslaved African Americans had their own complex relationship with the Revolution. The British offered freedom to enslaved people who escaped to their lines, and thousands took the opportunity. Some fought for American independence in hopes of earning their own freedom. Most remained enslaved, their status unchanged by a revolution fought in the name of liberty. The costs and contradictions were real, but so was the achievement. When the last British troops evacuated New York City on November 25, 1783, Washington led the Continental Army into the city in a ceremony marking the end of British rule. It had been 7 years since the disastrous New York campaign of 1776, 7 years since Washington had watched his army nearly destroyed, 7 years since the cause had seemed utterly hopeless. Now it was over. They had won. A few weeks later, Washington said farewell to his officers at Fraunce's Tavern in Manhattan. By all accounts, it was an emotional scene. These men had been through everything together: the freezing nights, the desperate battles, the moments when it seemed impossible to continue. They had endured because they believed in something larger than themselves. Washington embraced each of his officers in turn to move for words. Then he walked to the waterfront, boarded a barge, and began his journey home. Behind him, he left a nation. The American Revolutionary War proved something that powerful empires are always reluctant to acknowledge: that military superiority is not the same as victory. That occupied peoples who believe in their cause can outlast occupiers who don't. That ideas, in the end, are more powerful than armies. Farmers did not really beat the world's strongest army. Geography beat it. Time beat it. International alliances beat it. British mistakes beat it. The stubborn refusal of ordinary people to accept defeat beat it. But perhaps most importantly, an idea beat it: the idea that people have the right to govern themselves, that legitimacy flows from consent, that power ultimately belongs to the people. That idea has proven more durable than any empire. It has survived civil war and depression, world wars and cold wars, crises that would have destroyed lesser nations. It has been imperfectly realized, often betrayed, constantly contested, but it endures. The revolution that began with shots fired at Lexington and Concord, that survived the disasters of New York and the suffering of Valley Forge, that triumphed at Yorktown, that revolution created something new in the world. Not a perfect nation, but a nation capable of becoming more perfect. Not a finished project, but an ongoing experiment in self-government. George Washington, standing on the banks of the Delaware on Christmas night 1776, could not have known how the story would end. He knew only that surrender was unacceptable, that the cause was just, and that sometimes you have to risk everything for what you believe in. He crossed the river, and in crossing it, he and the ragged soldiers who followed him changed the world forever. That's how farmers beat an empire, not through superior firepower or better tactics, but through endurance, conviction, and the stubborn belief that their cause was worth any sacrifice. It was worth it. It is still worth it. The revolution continues.